I have kept time for sins that do not belong to the living. For 23 winters I climbed the tower steps by candle, crumb, and memory, my hands learning the old rope by feel as if it were a litany. The bell does not toll for the dead, not in the way the sacristans taught me. It tolls for those who have taken life, for those who carry a corpse inside the ribs of their conscience like a stone. It calls them, and when they answer, the monastery arranges itself around their confession. This is not a story of miracles. It is ledger and ledger kept in my own hand. I write to pin the sound down, to witness the bell as it claims the guilty. Ink steadies the voice that the midnight toll steals. The bell steals certainty, and leaves the thin and shivering thing I call remembrance. I will tell what I remember, not to salve me, but because silence is a different kind of indictment. My name is Brother Merrick. Once I kept the rope for. Once I fed the flame beneath the iron tongue. I am now dust to those who still read month lists and grain accounts, but the bell remembers me whether I am named or not. The monastery sits like a bruise on the landscape, rotting spires, cloisters full of wet stone, gutters eaten by moss that coughs green down into themselves. It crouches at the edge of a plain where the wind arrives not as weather but as remembrance. The brothers left before the winter, when the bell first chose to toll with no hand. They left their habits in wardrobes, their mortar and pestles on shelves. They took their grievances and their small holy objects and left me the rope and the key. The village below believes the place abandoned. Sometimes a shepherd's dog wanders close enough to stare up at the tower and then shrinks away, tail between its legs. They do not come at night. There are ways to mark time when no clock will hold to the hour. For me it was the sound of wax and the friction of stone on each palm as I climbed. The staircase is a child of damp and bell metal, so narrow two people cannot pass. My footsteps, when I learned to climb without waking, were small and careful, as if the monastery itself might dream if I were careless. I would stop 3 steps short of the bell room and listen. The bell's voice arrives before it is seen low, like the beating of a heart in a place without blood. It is a note not pitched to music but to memory. It finds the wrongness hidden in a life and lays the finger of accusation there. They say God calls the righteous, the bell called the guilty. Once a man arrived at the yard in the rain, soaked and smiling like a man who thinks his debts are paid. He had killed a neighbor in a scuffle over land, he told me later, and had burned the cottage to say the anger finished. He stood beneath the bell and did not look up. The bell called him, and the sound cut him into pieces made only of shame. He wavered, palms pressed to his breast like a supplicant, and his eyes became glass. That night the bell made him think of small things, the color of the child's hand he had pushed, the way the child's blouse had been misbuttoned the day they argued. He thought of his wife's voice wrong on a hymn. The bell does not name the crime. It enters a life like a memory and rearranges all the objects until the murderer sees the geometry of his own guilt. I watched him put his face in his hands and wept. I had to keep my tone even when his tears fell like rain on the stone. The bell does this. It does not allow the easy partition of causes. It does not let the murderer remain someone else. It brings the thought to the fore and insists on its truth. Sometimes they come in anger. A soldier once stood before the tower jaw like knotted rope. He had killed in a war that the maps had excused. He told me with fists that his hands were clean because his orders were law. The bell unspooled him with a patience I have never felt in men. When the note settled, the soldier was small as a boy. He began to list names of faces he had shoved into the mud, of those he had not tended when they called out. His voice stopped as if someone had throttled the syllables, then he laughed like a man surprised by himself. He did not leave the tower that night. He remained breathing shallow, until the first pale of dawn, when he slipped away like a shadow pulled off a wall. There is a choice the bell offers, though no one speaks of it plainly. When the sound reaches you, the world rearranges into a question. Some flee, others stay and answer. I have watched men, forced by the need to choose, pull the rope and make the bell strike once more with their own hands. They ring, and for a moment the world becomes simpler. The toll is a line drawn in the dark. Ring, and you close whatever ledger you have opened. Refuse, and sometimes you are dragged into a place where the bell keeps ringing whether there is sound or not. Both are punishments of a kind. I have seen the bell take its discretion and hand it back. A woman, the keeper of herbs, recorded once in the chapel rolls came in fog, because she had taken a life to save a child. She cradled what she had done like a coin and claimed it had been mercy. The bell made her replay the touch of the hand that had gone still, and the way the breath had left. When she could hold the memory without flinching, she smiled, small and wearied, and left. In the morning she returned to her garden with her back bent and hands steady. The bell had not punished her with its hunger in the way it fed on those whose hands had been stained by malice. Mercy, in the bell's calculus, is a different geometry. What the bell demands, I learned slowly, is not equality, it is honesty. If I confess fully, perhaps you will understand why I hated and loved the sound that ruled the tower. I do not describe my own sin in the courtroom voice of the repentant. I record it the way a ledger lists entries, facts, dates, the shape of a thing. Years before the bell first sang without hand, I was a younger keeper, greedy for order. We tied the rope to our wrists as a show of devotion and duty. There was a man who begged for bread at the cloister gate. The infirmary had passed him on, saying there was nothing. I looked at him and felt the first cold thing like a small creature nest under my ribs, the knowledge that passing the man by would not mark me. To save my order, to keep the monastery's grain stores safe for those who paid their dues, I allowed the man to be turned away. I told myself 1,000 little truths to keep the ledger clean. After him, another man came to me with a lantern and a hand that trembled like a bell-struck twig. He offered me a coin and asked if I had seen the beggar. I lied. I told him the man had left, that there had been nothing to be done. Later that night I found the coin under my cot, hidden with the same shame a man hides a wound. The bell does not learn to avoid punishment. It knows the value of a single act. Years later, when the bell began to call, that small act the lie, the convenience grew and shrank in my memory until I could not tell how many sins it had brought me. The bell calls for those who have killed, yes, but it makes room for those who have allowed killings by the geometry of their indifference. The first night I heard it toll with no hand, I blamed myself. I climbed. My fingers were raw from the rope. The flame guttered, making the bell room swim in distorted light. The bell sounded like a hand closing on the throat of the world. It named me without speaking, you who let it happen, you who are named by neglect. I thought the solution was to ring back, to return action for accusation. I took the rope and my muscles remembered how to pull. The bell struck, a sound that shook the rafters and threw the candlelight into brief, sane patterns. The man who had been knocking on the gate days before his son now heard it and stumbled into the yard. He looked up at me, confusion raw in his face. He said a single thing, "Why?" I could not say, "Because you were inconvenient." The rope trembled in my hands in a way that felt like confession. I stepped back and let the bell have its sentence. You learn the faces the bell brings you. There are some that haunt more than others, a pair of lovers who had argued in the market until one fell and did not resist. A magistrate who signed a death for politics, or a mother who smothered a child because she could not bear the hunger. I will not say the mechanics of their ends. The bell will not have that. The architecture of what it summons is not flesh and bone so much as memory and measure. People who come to the tower do not come for absolution in the way confessors sat by chapel steps with their stones of penance. They come because they cannot hold the sound back inside their bonus. They come because the ringing organizes terror into a shape that can be answered. Some want to lay the burden down. Some find, when confronted, that the bell's attention is more intolerable than the crime, and that desperation turns them into a new kind of cruelty. I have watched men pull at ropes with such fury that their knuckles bled. They ring until their lungs collapse, and the bell gives back nothing but more sound. There is a night the tower remembers, as if it were a bruise you can still press, and feel the ghost of a hand. A family of 3 arrived, all small and tight with cold. The youngest could not stop humming the song his mother once hummed while darning socks. The father had killed a man in a fight to stop a beating, he said. The bell came and found in their speech 1,000 small evasions. The man refused to describe the blow he had landed. He preferred to claim startling necessity. After the bell settled, he reached up and took the rope. His son watched with the habituated curiosity of children who learn rights young. The bell sounded once, twice. The man gave a pull like a penance, and then this is the part I find hard to write simple. He let the rope go. He turned to the child and pulled him close like a man learning to be reliable in a world that makes little provision for trust. That night the bell did not punish with fire or ruin. It did not need to. The smaller punishments sometimes are more painful, the rearrangement of memory, the insistence of truth like a splinter under the nail. That family left the tower begrimed but bound in something like honesty. If there is a lesson here, it is not mercy, and it is not cruelty. It is that sound shapes what we cannot face. The bell made me take inventory of my own ledger and, in doing so, taught me to measure others without illusion. I became the bell's scribe, the man who records how people stand when called. The rope is patient and the bell is merciless. You can try to plead with either, and you will only learn how elastic your own excuses are. Sometimes, when the tolls are long and the night is slow, I finger the small iron bell at my throat. It hangs there like a heartbeat. The cord of the rosary twisted rope fiber, frayed at the edges, is the only comfort I allow myself. It smells of wax and iron and the damp that lives in these stones. I am not an innocent man. I have not made myself innocent by watching the bell do what I once feared. Watching is an action too. The ledger fills. Once, when the tower roof cracked with frost, a stranger walked into the yard and asked to see the bell. He had a face that told of long roads and little sleep. He would not say what he had done. The bell called him. He listened like a man hearing music through a wall, like a man hoping the sound belonged to someone else. It did not. When the bell finished, he laughed in a way that was not merriment, but an attempt at the old warmth of a life without this sound in it. He took the rope between both hands and pulled. The sound hammered the courtyard. He turned to the ruins and spread his arms like a man offering himself to judgment. In the morning he was gone. The rope had frayed and hung like a pendulum in a poorly kept clock. I kept a scrap of that rope. Some relics are not whole if they are memory kept like a stone in the pocket to remember weight. There are those who have tried to silence the bell. They come with saws or with the crude threat of fire, or with superstition and the promise that a ritual might stop the sound. The bell resisted interference, and the monastery's stone took those attempts like a man takes punches scuffing and uneven, made uglier but intact. The maddest of them, a gossiping scribe down in the village, claimed he could bribe the bell with a copper idol stolen from a pagan shrine. He was found at dawn, eyes swollen, wandering like a man who had seen too much. Whatever he placed beneath the bell had no hold. The bell's voice is not for sale. At times I imagine a final tally, each toll given its own ledger line beneath which a name might be written. That comfort is childish. The bell's economy does not collate neatly. It is not an accounting ledger, it is an instrument of interrogation. It asks a single question without the patience for evasion. What did you do when the moment came? For some the answer is a bell pulled and a memory cleansed. For others it is a lifetime of hearing a sound, like a knuckle on a coffin lid, that will not stop until the bell takes it into the dark and leaves you with only your thoughts. To read my record is to see a place where the metaphors are literal. Memory is a ropa, guilt is a clapper. The tower keeps each toll like a tooth. Sometimes it glints in the fog like a memory the world would rather let sink. I write this because you must know there are instruments in the world that will command your honesty without an audience. The bell is indifferent to faith. It does not choose who deserves salvation. It chooses who will be made to see themselves. Do not think this is a tale of redemption. That would be a kinder world than the one in which I live. Some leave better than they arrived. Others do not. The bell is neither judge nor savior. It is a mirror with a mandate. It will not answer to piety. So I sit now in the rooms below the bell with the oil-stained hood gathered around my shoulders. My hands have the memory of rope in their joints. I keep a small iron bell on a cord about my neck, a habit as much as a superstition, and I know the smell of candle smoke as if it were a second skin. I have written the names and the nights and the decisions as the bell has offered them up. If you are tempted to come to the tower, know this: the bell does not cure you of what you have done. It only asks you to confront what has always been there. The toll makes a space in the dark and waits. Some step into that space and find a way out. Others discover that the bell has already been counting them, that the hour was soon to their bones long before they heard it. If you ask me whether I would ring again, had the chance, I would not lie. I would say yes and then correct myself, because truth in this place is crooked. The bell taught me that avoidance is its own form of murder. The ringing is a punishment and a mercy. That balance is what keeps me awake. When the bell tolls tonight, if it does, you will not hear it in the way a village hears a curfew. It will come as a pressure in the throat, a knowledge coiling like a snake in the chest. It will make you take inventory. It will demand a small and terrible decision. Whatever you choose, remember this: centuries pass, but the H lingers. The bell remembers all the ways men silence themselves. I am Brother Marek. I write with a hand that trembles but does not excuse. I have placed these pages where the wind will not take them, in a chest beneath the choir stalls, so that if I write by candle, the flame an accusation that refuses to be measured in comfort. The wax runs like the memory it lights, slow, inevitable, pooling into shapes that rid as names if you stare long enough. The monastery is a mouth that remembers the shape of every footstep, every breath that passed under its eaves. It remembers because stone remembers what men try to forget. I, Brother Marek, am the bell keeper who remained when the others left their tasks like moths abandoning a lamp that would not warn them. I am the one who keeps the record of a toll that calls only those who have taken a life. They left in stages, a few in winter, more in sprouts of spring, some never to be counted at all. I stayed because the bell required tending, because habit is an H that sits under the ribs, and because I had told the bell silently, as a man might tell his own hands that I would not let it lie. What began as duty hardened into other things, a ledger of the guilty, an instrument of confession, an oracle that demanded a price every midnight. There is a particular smell here between dusk and the thin lash of midnight. It is not simply damp stone and candle smoke. It is a metallic residue like the ghost of iron, the memory of blood that has seeped into mortar and never quite left. When I breathe it in, it lifts scenes into clarity as though the mind were a dark glass wiped free. Names surface, sometimes unbidden, sometimes like a surgeon's probe. The bell does not ring for the innocent. I tested that belief once, childishly, by standing at the tower lip while a wind tore along the courtyard. The bell was bone dry and heavy, the rope hung limp. A storm passed beneath the spire and the bell did not answer. It waits, it listens. The bell tolls alone when the point of midnight cleaves the hour, and that sound finds throat in the stone, and in the chest of one who has held a blade or driven another to death by words, starvation, or the slow cruelty of inattention. I have watched the bell call to men who carried guilt in different garments. A farmer who shoved his kin from a sliding wall, and buried it beneath a cart's wheel. A magistrate who signed an order to burn a tenant for the convenience of his ledger, a soldier who left a comrade to drown. The bell's summons is impartial to the instrument of death, it requires only the fact of it. And once the bell has touched a man with its sound, you can see the world rearrange itself around that man like glass refracting light. The first to answer the call came creeping like a child toward a forbidden fire. For 3 days he lingered on the monastery steps, stepping back as though the threshold were a wound he would not open. On the 4th night the bell tolled, and he walked up the stone like someone climbing a confession. He did not speak. He replaced his hands on the rope and felt the metal bite his palms. The way his fingers turned on the fiber read as a litany of denials. He said nothing. But he called what he had done by the weight he bore as he pulled. That night the bell hummed with a kind of private satisfaction. Another came with a proud face that cracked through the tolling into something slack and raw. He had been a town magistrate. He had sent a woman to the par for stealing bread she had stolen to save a son. She had been too thin to divide shame from hunger. He had told himself it was justice. The bell laughed at that word. The sound pressed its mouth against his face and left him pale, lips trembling, fingers fumbling for things they could no longer own, his keys, his seal, his robe. He left his garments on the chapel floor as though undressing for a bath he would not rise from. The bell did not free him. It only made his guilt visible, a shape that did not dissolve in prayer. There is a method to its cruelty. The bell does not force language into a man's mouth, it drills the shape of memory into the bones. It rewinds a night to the exact weight of an animal he carried or the exact bend of a blade. If the man flees or pretends, the bell returns, patient like an undertaker keeping watch. If the man stays and accepts the rope, he does not find absolution. He finds the arrangement of his life exposed friends who would not look at him, food that tastes of ash, asleep that is all needles. Public confession is scarcely the point. The bell wants more than a spoken horror. It wants a man to understand the measure of his own hand. When I first learned to read the bell, I catalogued in a ledger the nights of its toll, the people who answered, and the small changes that followed. That ledger smells like the bindings of a dead book. It is a record of transformations, a man resigned from being respectable to being resigned. A face once composed now slack like fruit left at the window, laughter cut clean of irony. The ledger became a crucible in which I tried to separate cause from effect. I failed. The bell will not be put into a thing with clear edges. There are nights when the bell calls those who do not consider themselves murderers. A woman who had poisoned a husband by patience, spoon by spoon of bittering tincture, answered it with the same flatness with which she had served wine. A boy who allowed his brother to bicycle into a frozen ford, because he laughed and pointed and did not think to hold the hand that slipped, he heard the bell, and became a man who kept his distance from running forks of rivers and children who laughed too loud. The bell is untroubled by degrees. It does not measure intention, it measures result. The monks who remained after the exodus gave reasons they thought respectable: piety, duty, the stubbornness of the aged. But the bell rearranged their reasons into a map of their failings. Brother Thomas, who used to sweep the refectory with a quick, indifferent motion, grew meticulous and slow. He began to inspect every plate as if he could spot a stain of guilt. He would pass his fingers along the lip of a cup and look at the small tremor of his hand as though it were a confession written in a tremulous hand. He did not speak of killing because his crime was carelessness. He locked a gate and a boy ran out and into a path and into a cart. The boy did not live. Thomas could not forgive the speed he had once prized. There is an economy to survival here. Men who answer the bell are not always punished by men. Sometimes the law of the monastery is the only law they must answer to. You will find no court, no formal penance, only changes in how the world regards them and how they regard themselves. A man may do penance by a lifetime of small, exacting kindnesses, but kindness does not erase the fact that a hand once did a thing that cannot be undone. What I do each midnight is listen, then write, and sometimes count breaths. I have become an archivist of shame. The bell's sound presses across the black and leaves me with sequences of images that feel like fossils beneath the skin. I do not interfere. For a long time that refusal felt moral. I told myself that the bell was a test and my role was to document its passing. But witness is not always neutral. To record is to decide what matters. In that ledger I have decided which names to keep and which to let melt. That is a responsibility that sundered the complacency of my soul. The tolls press upon the body like winter. When the bell rings, I feel a trembling in my own hands that is not all sympathy. I think of my own history like a ledger's margin note. Once I kept the bell because it was a job. Once I kept it because I loved the precision of the rope's fibers sliding between fingers. Once I denied the darker accounting of my life. I was younger then and thought ignorance could be a kind of moral garment. The bell removed that covering. There is one night I return to often, as if it were a hinge the rest of my life swings upon. A cold year when the snow lay like a page of folded paper, and the town below rationed bread by a public bell. A stranger came to the village, a young man, with a face like a broken coin, and he accused a trader of cutting a purse and stole a horse for an escape he had not planned to keep. The trader fought back and the stranger fell. No one lifted a hand to help him up. They stood with heavy shoulders and eyes away, and the man died with a name that would later flit across the bell's song. Later, the trader swore it had been self-defense. Later, the town forgot it altogether. The bell did not forget. I remember the way the snow swallowed footprints and how small the corpse looked in a world that kept moving. Once, in a fit of presumption, I thought I could teach the bell to spare someone. There was a man who had killed because he had been forced to a conscript with a pistol pointed at another whose only sin was the misfortune of being on the losing side of a skirmish. The soldier who had pulled the trigger had the look of one who had to close his eyes and let another's life happen in a single mechanical diction of muscle and sound. I thought maybe his heart was too broken to be called. I was wrong. The bell tolls on principle, not on mercy. The tolling is not equal. Some nights the sound is thin as a wire, some nights it is thick and roars like a beast. The thickness is proportional to the stubbornness of the deed. Some acts of killing are neat and quick, as if cut with a surgeon's blade. Others are extended as a slow unpicking of a garment until sinew shows. The bell's voice tells me this truth in wavering harmonics. People ask me, when they arrive and linger and pretend to be passing travelers, whether the bell is a curse or a blessing. They ask the question as if it is answerable in either direction. It is not. The bell is a compass that points only one way, to the center of the self where certain acts sit and refuse to be anonymized. Sometimes the bell frees a man by making him transparent, sometimes it ruins him by making him visible to himself in ways that can never be reconciled. I have found that the bell's calling bends a man's future into two forms: those who answer and learn the architecture of their hands, and those who flee and become people who avoid every mirror. The fleeing do not live lighter. They live in a constant redirection, as if an arrow aimed at their feet keeps them always moving. The answering may still not grant peace. It grants a precise knowledge that will not let the mind roam to soft places. The bell teaches the anatomy of consequence. There is a final acuteness I must confess to. The bell's sound sometimes feels like it is calling me. I have no counselable death on my ledger that I did with a blade, but I have been a witness who could have yet done more in small moments. I remember a boy who would have been saved if I had wrested an errant rope from a biasing hand, if I had kept a gate open rather than choosing the exactitude of duty. That memory has the density of a nugget of iron. It is a thing you cannot bend and so must keep weighted in your chest. When the bell speaks, I have wondered if its voice is asking if I will answer. If I will give admission not of a single blade, but of the many times my inaction became an accomplice. The bell does not accept excuses. It listens and it names. Once, in a cruelty of conscience, I tried to list my apologies like candles in a window. The bell answered with silence, and later with a quick, bright toll that was almost a laugh. It seemed to say, small lights do not matter when the house has been set to flame. This is not theological. This is the law of an instrument that is older than mercy, and perhaps older than us as men. It rings because something in the world knows how to weigh the human hand with terrible precision. When dawn arrives, the bell's voice is a memory that sits in the bones of the place. The ones who have answered leave shadows at the edges of their faces that sunlight cannot smooth. Some become keepers of the sick and poor with an obsession that could be read as atonement. Some speak no more. Some are seen only at night through slits in curtains, waking as though of a sleep that does not relieve. I write this now to set down what the bell has made me see. I keep the ledger. I have taken to binding a thin book each season and burying it in the hollow of a floor joist under the pulpit. If the monastery collapses into moss, perhaps some future hand will pry the wood and find this accumulation of names and nights. And if the finder is not cowardly, they will read and know that there are things in the world that demand a witness, even if the witness cannot rescue every guilty soul. The bell has taught me to count differently. I do not count nights in the usual way. I count them in tolls: the thin, the thick, the laugh, the sigh. I count the way a man's hands tremble when he ties his shoes. I count the way a woman turns water to tea and measures the minutes as if timing a confession. In these small instruments of living, the bell's voice keeps echoing. There is no finality in what I tell. There are no simple absolutes. Men answer. Men flee. Some meet the bell and find in the tone a shape to live within. Others disintegrate into margins of themselves. As for me, I have learned to listen without wanting to be soundless. I have learned how dangerous it is to think that bearing witness is a neutral thing. The bell has taught me to hold my own name with a certain hand. There are nights still when, at the toll, I find a particular hunger in my chest that is not the hunger of sleep nor of the body, but of something that asks me to choose. If you ask whether the bell is a punishment, an instrument of justice, or a haunting, I will say it is whatever the person who hears it needs it to be, and it is worse than all of those simultaneously. It is precise and pitiless. It is the sound the world makes when it remembers what men have done to one another. I leave these pages as a map of that sound. If you ever come to the monastery and hear a bell ring alone at midnight, know this: it is calling a name that cannot be reclaimed. It is calling for the ledger beneath our feet and the small, terrible truths none of us wants to own. For those who want neat endings, there is none. The stone keeps its memory. The bell keeps its purpose. And I keep my candle and my ledger and the knowledge that some things cannot be undone. Some nights I imagine a time when no one answers the bell, when its sound either grows silent with the extinction of its audience, or when the world has learned some new pattern that stops death from occurring in the forms it once took. That hope is tender and perhaps foolish. For now the bell tolls and names, and I, who have tended it through years of frost and wind, set pen to page and wait until the next midnight asks me yet again what I will do with what I know. I began to write because silence became a form of violence. The bell had always been part of the stone. It hung like a throat carved from iron in the monastery tower, a dull mouth that could speak without hands. I learned, in the first nights after the men stopped coming and the living left, that sound is a memory given weight. The bell did not toll for the weather or the hour, it tolled for transgression. It tolled for the taking of a life. It tolled for blood kept secret in pockets and in the chest. When the bell sang at midnight, it was a summons and an accusation, and I, our foolish guardian, kept a ledger of who answered. I am Brother Merrick. I've kept the bell since before this place fell silent. I am not a man of sentiment. That is what I tell myself as I record each toll. My hands are steady. My script is precise. The habit I wear is patched in the same dull palette as the stone's charcoal, ashen grey, faded brown. The iron rosary I wear at my neck is small and heavy. A tiny bell hangs there as if to mock the larger one. I finger it as I write. I trace the furrows of my face with the pads of my fingers as I move between memory and counting. Each line I write is a judgment only I can bear. The monastery is a ruin of good intentions. Once there was chanting and ordered misgivings, a geometric consolation of prayers. Now corridors keep breath like mildew. The bell tower, high and ragged, looks out over a courtyard that forgets the sky. The ropes that once fell smooth and taut are frayed, knotted with the fingers of time. Wax from countless candles pools in the corners of niches, forming small islands of light that do nothing to warm the air. The stones remember footsteps. They remember a footfall that did not belong. The first time the bell rang without a hand, I thought the wind had a new language. I stood in the tower with a candle guttering, watching the rope swing though there was no trusted hand upon it. The sound was not simple. It arrived as a deep arc, a physical thing you could place against your ribs. When it died away, it left behind a pressure, like a room emptied of something living. After that first toll, a light came to the monastery, the return of names. Names arrive with a knock or a shadow, sometimes with a note left under the latch of a cell. Once, a woman with salt at her lip came in with a child, wrapped in a blanket, and looked straight at the tower as if seeking permission. But the bell does not call for everyone. Its summons is selective, surgical in its cruelty. It calls for those who have taken another's life. Whether by malice or by accident, whether in desperation or in a calculated hush, the bell claims them. It is not satisfied with confession alone. It calls the guilty to the place where sound holds them accountable. When a name answers the bell, I have seen the manner of response vary like weather. Some come stumbling beneath the cloak of shame, faces rearranged by insomnia, eyelids like shuttered windows. Others mount the steps with a clean gait and a hardness behind the jaw that suggests they have practiced the forgetting of names. The bell, in its merciless impartiality, insists that the answer be made in presence. It wants witnesses. It wants the accused to feel the acoustic clarity of accusation and perhaps, though I will not say this with hope, to be given the chance to choose. Choice is precious and terrible. The bell does not only name who, it offers three possibilities. The first is to climb the tower and pull, to take the rope and toll the sound until your arms tremble and the iron mouth tires. Those who choose this become confessors by labor, sending a sound into the world that marks them as both the knower and the knower's sin. The second is to stand beneath the bell and listen, accepting the sound as sentence, and to leave without touching rope or stone, carrying the toll inside like a slow poison. The third is to refuse, to accept silence and never show. Many of those walk away and vanish, their lives wound tighter with the secret the bell demanded they acknowledge. I have watched all three. I have watched hands make the sign of the cross as they ascend. I have watched fingers curl white around rough rope and feel the complaint of strained sinew as a man tolls his own guilt. I have watched others stagger down the stairs and vomit into the shadowed corners, as if the sound had physical volume they could not swallow. I have watched those who refuse fold inward, and like moths burn away at the edges of their lives. The first time I recorded a tally, my script was neat, and the edges of each letter lined as if with a blade. The name was simple. The man had pushed another from a bridge in a moment of righteous fury. He had later come to the monastery to seek shelter and anonymity. The bell named him. He came alone. He pulled and pulled until his knuckles were raw, and the bell answered him like a mirror. As the sound ran through the stone, I realized what the bell asks is not only confession but contemplation. The toll forced him to hear the consequence of his act, repeated until the echo became a figure in the room with him. He left after that night, hollow and different. He lived long enough for that hollow to calcify into a kind of loneliness that was, in itself, a punishment. The second man was more complex. He had killed in a fever of fear, a blade taken in a panic that unstitched the order of his life. He came to us later, pale and careful, offering hands for blessing though there was no warmth in their flesh. The bell called him at midnight, and he climbed the tower with a deliberate pace. He stood before the bell for a long time without touching rope, listening to the metal settle into silence. When he finally left, he put a small stone at the threshold of the chapel and never spoke again. His silence became another sort of sacrament, a steady presence of regret that made rooms feel heavier and the air more honest. There are darker instances. The bell once called a man who had killed deliberately, who had learned to make the taking of life into an economy of control. He appeared at dawn as if from the mist itself, face composed and hands without trimmer. He climbed and made the bell scream on a rope he held like an offering. When he finished, he laughed softly. The laughter was not mere cruelty, it was a statement of defiance. He returned to the world convinced his act was without cost. For a time, he appeared untouched, yet the bell leaves marks in other ways. Sleep deserts you, and the simplest pleasures acquire edges. The bell is not a tribunal with a single sentence it is a mirror whose shattering refracts a life into slivers that cut in different seasons. On one occasion the bell tolled and no one came. The night was so cold the breath of it smoked in the light of the candle. I went to the tower and found a child's toy, a chipped wooden horse lying in the courtyard. The name written in the margin of my ledger was not a man, but a collective, a household head, whose negligence had led to a child's death. The bell had called the guilty, but how could it have expected them to answer when the guilt was diffused across silence and small compromises? The rope swayed gently in a wind that did not exist. I felt in that moment as if the bell itself grieved for the way responsibility slips away like water between fingers. The ledger I keep is a litany of small grotesques. Names appear with brief annotations, a date, a manner, a small word of observation, pushed, blunt, accident, deliberate, refused. I write because writing contains the sound and places it on paper. In the act of inscription, I attempt to turn the ephemeral weight of tolling into something that can be held. Each entry unspools another memory, the scent of damp wool, the scrape of leather, the sound of a footfall too early for the hour. I am meticulous in these notations. I believe they serve as a map for me to navigate the catalogue of culpability that accumulates like fungus in the cold. There is a pattern to the bell's choices, or so I have convinced myself over the years. It is attracted to choices made in the dark deeds concealed behind compulsion, unexamined anger, or the narcotic thinking that others are less than. The bell often calls those who believe themselves absolved by necessity. It calls for mercy's absency. It calls for those who decided to allow pain to exist for the convenient sake of a plan. It does not call tyrants alone. It calls the clever as well as the terrified. In this way the bell reveals a doctrine. Sin is less about the violence of an act than the collapse of moral imagination that allows the act to occur. I do not know why the bell chooses.
My hand.
I prefer not to ascribe to the divine a taste for
trembles.
cruelty. Perhaps it is not a divine instrument at all, but an old mechanism, a left-behind relic that found a law of its own. Perhaps it is memory taking the shape of metal. Or perhaps the world is stitched with more agency than we know, and the bell is only the place where consequences gather like ash. Any explanation feels too tidy. So I stick to observation. The bell rings, names come, choices are made. The tolls have consequences beyond the called. Community's fabric is altered not only by confession, but by the act of listening. Those who remain and hear the bell change. Food tastes different, sleep shrinks into thin slices. The monks who stayed moved through the day with a smaller voice. Conversations became obliquous sentences, trailed into the smell of candle smoke. The bell creates a kind of liturgy of attention, yet attention here is less reverent and more convicting. We are all, in the wake of its sound, compelled to examine whether we have ever been the slightest instrument of harm. I must confess another truth. There were nights when I held the rope. When I first discovered that pull, I thought of duty, of the mechanics of ritual, and I thought to test the voice of the bell. I did not think, in those hours, of the lives the sound would summon. I thought only of knowledge and control. The first time I pulled with intention, I felt a guilt I had not anticipated. The bell answered, and for a moment I was not the clerk of suffering but its author. The sound made a space in the air that left me feeling obscene, as if I had manufactured accusation. I learned quickly to resist the temptation of curiosity. To summon is to name, and to name is to consign. That lesson has cost me nights of wakeful remembrance. Sometimes those summoned do things that defy expectation. A woman once climbed and, instead of pulling, removed her hands from the rope and began to chisel. With the blunt edge of a nail she found in a seam of the stair letters into the bell's yoke. She wrote a single word that I discovered the next morning when I came up to clean the wax and silence. She had carved "Remember" in a shaking hand. I do not know whether the act was defiance, piety, or madness. Her hand bled while she worked. Her fingerprints were dark on the iron. She left before dawn. The letters remained like a vow scratched into the throat of the bell. There are rituals I have invented around it to preserve my own sanity. Each night before the tolling hour I sweep the tower, set 3 candles in the niches, and count the knots in the rope. I hang the small iron bell of my rosary in a place where it catches candlelight, and I listen. The act of preparation is a way to frame the unpredictability. It gives the night a structure. But ritual cannot fix a thing that is not meant to be fixed. The bell's business is not to mend, it is to reveal. People sometimes ask me, those rare travelers who still knock at the door of the monastery, whether the bell is mercy or punishment. I cannot answer. I can only say this: the bell turns the private into the public without consent. It forces a reckoning that some find terrifying and others find necessary. It is a mirror, a sentence, and sometimes, in a cruel inversion, a way of ensuring a kind of continuity. The man who pulls a rope until his arms will not hold bears a confession that marks him in the town markets and farmyards. He leaves a different man. The one who refuses carries a secret like an ember in the breast, which is its own slow combustion. At times I imagine a day when the bell will be silent forever. Stone will crumble, and the rope will rot into dust. The ledger will moulder into nothing, and the names will be indistinguishable from the moss. Perhaps that is mercy. Yet I fear the silence. Silence has a promised sanctity, but in practice it can be a tomb. The bell, for all its severity, insists upon a conversation with consequence. The townspeople who have fled into the world beyond these ruined spires carry within them a new attentiveness. They hear the sound of their own decisions in different rooms. That is a small good. Tonight I write another entry. The name came on the wind in the same tone it always does, a low, inevitable arc through the bones of the house. I lit a candle with hands that do not tremble as much as they used to, and I climbed. The rope looked like a dark river through my fingers. I did not touch it. I did not want to be author of the summons. Instead, I set the ledger open on the sill and wrote. My script was smaller than usual, because the act of putting words to the bell calmed a part of me that still believed in record as remedy. I write to set a boundary between the bell swill and my bearing. I write because silence felt like a participation in the erasure of consequence. I write because names deserve to be held, however poorly. I write because sound carves memory, and memory wants a hand to keep it from drifting. If these pages survive me, let them be an inventory of the ways in which we answer calls. Let them also be a warning, a toll that requires no hand can still demand the heaviest of human reckonings. The bell rings in midnight. It rings in our listening and in the way we measure ourselves. It rings for those who have killed, and its echo does not leave them unmarked. Some will climb, some will stand and listen, some will never come at all. Centuries pass, but the pain lingers. The stone holds it like a cold debt. I will keep writing until the ink runs dry or my hand fails. After that, if the bell continues, it will find other recorders or none at all. What remains in the end is the sound and the choice that follows. The bell waits. I wait with it. The rope is frayed, the candle is low, and my ledger is open. I set down truth as one sets down a weight that has been carried too long carefully, with measured breaths, because sudden movement stills what is held within. I have kept the bell and I have kept its secret. For years my hands have moved along the same worn rope and the same rough stone, tracing grooves left by 1,000 small repetitions. And in that quiet work I learned to listen the way other men learn to read. The bell taught me a new language, not of words, but of vibrations, of a slow remembering that came through the ribs and the jaw instead of the ears. This is the record of the fourth toll, the night that forced a choice from my fingers and from the thin band of men who lingered at the monastery's edge. The monastery sits like a bruise on the countryside, a cluster of rotten, bowed stone that the maps still mark out of habit. Winters lingered longer than they should, and evenings blurred into a kind of grey that stole the edges from everything. In that palette the bell looked like a tooth left in the dark, dull, pitted, and impossible to ignore when it moved. The tower that housed it leaned like an old man listening for a voice he once knew. There is an architecture to silence here, carved by priests' long-dead corridors designed to swallow sound, niches to catch confession like small animals, stairs that win to cut breath into measured pieces. The bell sits above all of it, patient. I became bell keeper because I was both needed and small. The order needed a man who would not be missed. I needed a task that required hands and not questions. At 42 my body remembers frost more readily than warmth. My habit is patched, my hair cropped unevenly, my palms are stained from oil and rope fiber. The iron rosary at my neck clinks against the small bell I carry like a private echo. I am not a holy man. I am someone who could stare at a single stone slab until the stone told me what it had seen. In the monastery, every surface is a ledger of injuries. I read them. The bell tolls at midnight, but not all midnights are equal. There is a cold logic to its ringing. It calls without wind or hand a purge that seems mechanical and intent at once. The first time I heard it when I was newly assigned, I thought the sound came from the weather, a loose rope, a gust. The sound was wrong, though, and wrongness has a shape. It made the hair along my forearm raise, as if the bell were reading the skin for ink. It calls only those who have killed. I do not mean those who have become instruments of battle or executioners by title. The bell calls those who have taken another's life, whether by blade, by lie, by neglect, or by the small compounding violences that accumulate until a life unravels. The verdict it issues is neither chapter nor scripture. It is a summons, and summonses demand a response. There is a ritual rhythm to the nights when the bell tolls. The small iron bell at my neck sounds like a dry cough in the vaults, wax pools in gutters. The air tastes of stone and old prayer. Men who have not heard the bell pass into their routine as the others become satellites, drawn inward. There is no public proclamation, no pageant. The call is private in the way of needles and knives. It aims at the flesh it knows. The first called was a hunter from the village below. He had taken a life on a drunken winter morning, or so the ledger said, a tangle over land and pride. He came to the tower in a stupor of regret, feet leaving wet marks along the stair. When the bell moved for him, he came as if invited, pale hands meeting the rope with surprise and then a quick understanding. He did not speak. There was a short, necessary thing he did with his shoulders, a bending I would later name as apology. The bell tolled once for him, a damp sound that seemed to go through his ribcage. He left afterward with blank eyes and slightly soothed hands. He lived, and the bell had asked nothing more than that he bear the knowledge. There are patterns. The bell does not punish in the sense we expect, but it engineers a confrontation. Some nights it demands the ring itself, it demands that the summoned man or woman take hold of the rope and pull. Sometimes the ring is a single slow toll. Other times it is a series, each beat measured so that the summoned knows every second is chosen. On the night of the fourth toll the bell offered itself to a different kind of choice. And it did so with a deliberate cruelty I have now come to recognize. That night the fog lay thick as a seal. The monastery's spires dissolved into a low cloud, and the courtyard's slabs were wet with a mist that never quite became rain. I had traced the wall of the tower by touch, as is my habit, when the bell shuddered and then spoke. The sound came without preamble, long and sure, and it carried in a way that made the small iron at my throat sound like a child's rattle. The men who were there greeted it with the same hollow of recognition, that first intake that precedes action. They clustered not by command but by habit, drawn like moths to the last light. The bell called a soldier who had once guarded a lord's caravan. His hands remembered knots and orders. He arrived with boots still crusted in mud and a gait that suggested he was used to waiting for commands. In the months before I began to record these occurrences, I would have believed that the bell's summons was cruel and absolute. It called, and the called complied, because something older than law compelled them. But the soldier's eyes were not empty when he looked at the rope. They were calculating, and that calculation is the fulcrum of what happened. He placed his fingers on the rope, and held them there without pulling. The rope hung like the spine of a sleeping thing between his palms. For a breath the tower was a clock wound too tight. Stone listened, the iron listened, I listened. Then another figure moved from the shadows and stepped toward him. No words passed between them. There was a kind of recognition in their postures, like two old instruments finding the same note. The second man's face was partly in shadow. I could see a thin scar and the tightness at the mouth that comes from an old, private guilt. He was not of the order, but he had been close enough to see the bell twice before. He had been called once and had survived whatever it was that followed. The second man took hold of the rope with one hand and put his other hand lightly on the first's wrist. The contact was not an instruction but a weighing. The bell is not a legal sentence that arrives with a prosecutor and witness. It is a personal adjudication that presses against a person's worst self and asks whether he will own what he has done. The soldier's fingers tightened, and then his shoulders folded the way of a man who remembers a fall. He did not pull. The second man let go slowly, the air tasting of oil and cold wax, and the rope swung with a single, terrible arc. When the bell tolls there is an effect I have learned to name but never to explain. It rearranges time around the body of the called, so that each second becomes a presence. In that presence memories that had been asleep awaken, minute images of hands, of faces, of small mercies not given. The soldier's memory returned with an abrupt clarity, the night in which he had taken a life in the crooked light of a wayside inn, the mouth forever still. The echo of a name that would not leave him. The bell does not tell him what to feel. It offers him the scene he set in motion, replayed in the clarity of water. Whether that clarity grants absolution or damnation is not for the bell to decide. It only insists on facing. The monk in me watched like a surgeon with a cracked mirror, clinical, detached, unable to soften. But the man who had lived a life of taking and not asking questions felt something else, a specific and corrosive fear. The bell's call had made choice possible, and choice is a sharp blade when one is not prepared. There is a moment when a man will either pull the rope and accept some strange ritual belonging to the bell's design, or he will step away and carry the knowledge alone. Either way, the bell exerts a pressure. It is both an invitation and a test. On previous nights, the chosen had sometimes pulled the rope with eyes closed, with a shaking hand, with an expression like a man reaching towards sleep. Others have climbed the tower and thrown the rope over the next parapet and left it to swing unattended. Sometimes nothing further happens. Sometimes afterward people do strange things. They walk into the river and do not come up. They write long lists of names and then burn them. They dig holes in the earth and fill them with stones until the weight is unbearable. I have catalogued such outcomes because the record is the only place I can find cause. The bell is not a judgeth, the bell is a lever and a question. That night the choice between pulling and stepping away broke into a third possibility. A man in the courtyard, a boy almost a grandson of one of the lay brothers, had crept up to the tower and watched from a shadowed niche. He had never killed someone with his hands, but he had been complicit in a scandal years earlier. A small betrayal that let a man die alone in the fields because they were afraid of scandal more than of saving a life. The bell did not call him, but his presence mattered. He stood as witness to the soldier's decision, and suddenly the soldier looked up, as if a mirror had been held to his face. For the first time, the soldier saw the reflection of the world his actions had made. Choices radiate. What one man does can make a corridor of consequences open or close for another. The soldier's fingers trembled. I fingered the little bell beneath my habit without thinking and felt the same small tremor in my own hand. I had a tool at the neck, a rusted key on a thong, a habit patched in predictable patterns, a ledger full of names. I had a responsibility, official and secret, to document appearances and to note how the bell's summons changed the village and the men who belonged to it. In that documentation I had always tried to be objective, but objectivity is a brittle thing when someone is about to pull the rope. He did not pull. He stepped back with a kind of wrenched relief, as if the bell had offered him both the rope and the knowledge that he might refuse the ritual and yet be bound nevertheless. The second man left then, slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying something the soldier could not yet see. The soldier descended the stairs, his shoulders taut, the memory lodged in his chest like a thorn. The bell swung and struck with a single low arc, a sound that was not triumphant but like a counting breath. Afterward the village was a different place for a few hours. People moved with a new carefulness. The hunter checked the hems of his sleeves, as if afraid of finding blood there. The boy who had watched the soldier returned to his bed and did not sleep. Morning found him at the monastery gates, waiting with an empty look I have since learned to translate as seeing beyond the ordinary veil. The bell's action rippled outward, a stone dropped in a dark well. The soldier's refusal to ring did not mean he was absolved. The ledger grew heavier. Men fall differently when they have seen what they are. Some grow more cautious, others become more dangerous. For weeks after the toll, I recorded patterns. A woman who had kept silence during her father's slow illness started to write lists and burned them. A smug official who had arranged a death by paperwork left the town and was found months later with his throat cut, a single ring of rope around his fingers as if he had tried and failed to pull. The small everyday violences which accumulate into killing are many-headed. The bell makes no distinction among them. It calls the consequence and leaves the means of response in the hands of those addressed. I cannot explain how the bell chooses. Perhaps it does not choose in human terms. Perhaps it is a reaction to imbalance, a mechanism that detects a fracture in social measure and rings at the point of greatest stress. Perhaps the bell is a relic of some older covenant that demanded reciprocity where law had failed. I do not offer a theology because my work is not to preach but to nota, to put names to nights, and to measure what follows. The bell's law is more primitive than doctrine. It is a pressure on the sternum. The choice at midnight is not solely about pulling a rope. It is about how a life accounts for itself. Those who answer the bell by ringing may be seeking atonement, may be submitting to an ancient ceremony that dissolves complicity into act. Those who refuse may be attempting a different kind of survival, the pretense of denial, the hope that knowledge can be folded inward like a map hidden in a book. Both paths are dangerous. Both paths change the walker irrevocably. I have kept a ledger of these events in the margins of one page and in the memory of my palms. I have noted how the bell extracts certain things. The first is recognition, the second is the confrontation with motive, the third is the aftermath. Recognition arrives as an image so vivid that it cannot be ignored. Motive comes as a memory of the smallest decision, the tilting of a spoon, the closing of a door. Aftermath is the slow, physical rearrangement of life, diminished appetite, sudden rage, an obsession with small rituals to distract from larger guilt. Some men try to drown the ringing in clerical routines, others run. There is a cruelty in the bell's impartiality. It is not interested in fairness. It responds to the fact of having been complicit in ending a life. It will call the man who struck a single, panicked blow as readily as it will call the one whose hands were surgical and deliberate. The bell makes no moral accounting. It only forces witness and choice. Perhaps the clearest violence the bell commits is to remove the shelter of ignorance. For many, the bell opens a window they cannot close. In time, the tower taught me something I resist admitting, that silence is not a refuge. Those who thought they could hide from the bell by swallowing confession or by building a life of small lies found themselves paced by a phantom ringing in their bones. They imagine the sound sometimes, an absence as loud as presence. They dream of ropes and of the shape of the bell rim. The man who avoids the tower does not avoid the bell, he carries the potential toll under his skin. My ledger grows thick, and the night of the fourth toll sits heavy on the pages. The soldier's refusal to pull did not end the matter, it redirected it. The bell keeps insisting in different tongues. Voices that had been quietened by fatigue or shame rose later in the year. Some men came to me, not to confess in the way the order expects, but to say, without ceremony, that they had been called and that the world thereafter tasted different. I listened and wrote, feeling the small iron at my throat as a metronome. If the bell is, as some have whispered, a divine warning, then its warning is not in the form of thunder. It is a domestic, private thing that allows a moment of personal accounting. If it is a curse that insists on attention. In either reading, the burden remains on the living. I have no power to invert the bell's purpose. I cannot silence it. I can only record what it does and ask whoever reads these pages to attend to the shape of consequence. Often I wonder who would be spared if the bell simply ceased. Would the village breathe easier? Would the men walk freer? Or would they, deprived of that incisor of truth, sink into deeper forms of cruelty because there was no instrument to force clarity? The bell is a cruel instrument, but within its cruelty there is a strange mercy, the insistence on seeing. In the weeks and months that followed the fourth toll, I continued to walk the walls and trace the rope with my fingers. The man who did not pull still passed the tower occasionally, always a little later than the others, always with his gaze flicking away from the parapet. The boy who had watched him returned to school, and when the bell began to toll that night, its sound did not belong to the world.
I am not who you think I am.
It belonged to a memory, a slow, metallic refusal that wound itself into bone and held there like a splinter. I knew its voice by the shape of the shadows it threw, not the simple shadows of oak and stone, but the long, barbed silhouettes of choices made under pressure and the small, private cruelties we dress as necessity. The bell called in a language my chest recognized it. It called the guilty by their weight. I had learned to listen so closely that my ribs had become a set of resonant chambers. I am neither penitent nor proud. I am a man reduced to record. That is the mercy I afford myself, the ledger of the tolls. I write as if writing can arrest an echo. The monastery stands half-eaten by weather and neglect, its roof jagged like broken teeth. Its stones are salt, stained and soft where rain has been patient enough. Moss climbs the steps and curtains of ivy sip at the mortar. The yard below the belfry is a pit of wet flagstone and old bones of gardens, where the sky hangs lowering like an accusation. Here, at the periphery of towns that still whisper of saints, the bell is an old thing with a new hunger. Every midnight it wakes and strikes, once for those taken before their time, twice for those who killed in anger. Thrice, I learned, for the murderers who insisted on believing themselves judges. Before I touch the rope, I listen to its memory. The bell does not toll for the dead who have been allowed silence, or for those who passed in beds beneath a quiet hearth. It tolls for transgressive hands, the knuckled fist that found a throat, the blade that finished what bravado began, the push that turned an argument into a tome. The bell is not a keeper of law. It is a ledger that purrs the truth in a tone the world cannot deny. I have heard it call names not aloud, but in the way the air curls around corners when guilt passes. The sound unsettles the night because guilt cannot sit still. It is a living thing that shifts and scratches and seeks an opening. I was the bell keeper because, once, I learned to hide a crime beneath the color of devotion. I came to the monastery as a refugee of circumstance, a loner with implements of war in hand, carrying on my person the stench and momentum of violence. I believed, in the innocent arrogance of youth, that a habit could be a cloak, that prayer could be a balm for the parts of me I preferred not to examine. The monastery accepted men who wanted to forget. It accepted me and kept me for reasons that seem obvious now. Broken men are easy to bind to ritual. The place wrapped itself around failure like linen around a relic. I kept the bell because it needed an attendant, and because I loved the discipline of ropes and iron. I loved the mathematics of tension and release, the way a rope answered to the palm like a partner. The habit became a costume for concealment. Over years I carved a space between my face and my past, careful steps, slow prayers, a voice that measured confession like a metronome. The bell asked for nothing in exchange. At first it was indifferent. Indifference is a cold teacher. That indifference was the cruelest thing. Indifference gives you room to believe you are better than you are. It allowed me to catalogue the tolls without flinching, to tally them as a clerk tallies coins. Each peal was a notation in a book I would not let anyone read. The more I listened, the more the bell taught me the anatomy of remorse, how it enters the chest as a cold, how it moves like a solvent through memory, how it leaves stains you scrub and cannot remove. I recall a night when the bell struck and the sound clawed at my sleep until I rose and opened the trapdoor and found a man on the landing. He had hair like wool, and his hands shook as if the bone itself was a thought. He had been called. He came because the bell had known him regardless of the town refuse he hid behind. He confessed nothing. No one who is called by that bell speaks at first. They come because something in them is lighter when they approach the place that summoned them. They come because guilt, when named, is given a body, and even the aching of a wound is preferable to the pressure of a secret. I watched them approach in the arc of candlelight, faces like peeled fruit, shoulders curved inward to protect whatever is left. They stood before the base of the bell like supplicants at a shrine, hands pressed flat to the stones, eyes white as pith. Some knelt, some vomited. Some laughed in the small, terrible way of those who have folded their terror into absurdity. The bell demanded nothing, but each person believed it would reward or punish. They brought their own verdicts. The bell's summons does not liberate, it reveals. When it calls, it drags a memory through the throat of the listener and leaves it raw. Men I thought simple turned to intricate histories in those tremulous minutes beneath the tower. A farmer who had once struck a boy to quiet him unfolded to me as a man who had been trained to strike by one who struck, and by centuries that taught fists as a way to survive. A soldier, nicked by war and unworthy of humane thought, became a set of choices made at dawn, orders given without room for doubt, hunger and frost at the heels, the mathematics of survival that dehumanize in practice. None of these acts were clean. None had the charity of a single, defensible sin. The bell does not measure intent, it measures fact. On nights when the bell rang, I kept an iron rosary tight in my palm and remembered the shape of my own hands that had closed on another's throat in the dark. The memory came back not as a single image, but as a college of small violences, a shove that became too forceful a blade, intended to wound but finding tender flesh. A command given and a man obeying, and the obedience sealing a fate. Guilt is fractal. One act reflects into others, each a smaller echo that binds to the next until the pattern is endless. I could count the ways to justify the deed. The justifications were as many as the stars, but each seemed thinner at midnight. You might ask why I did not confess. Why, if the bell calls only those who have killed, did I persist in silence? Confession is a tricky thing. It promises absolution, but often returns the sinner to a new cage. To confess in these parts is to invite a different cruelty. Men in the town who believe they are jurors will drag you into lit squares and call for reparation measured in the currency of humiliation. Besides, confession is not always a purgation. Sometimes it is a ledger that others turn pages of to see if they can profit. So I wrote. I wrote as if my hand could perform atonement by repetition. I catalogued names, the cadence of the bell, the posture of those who answered it. I made lists and cross-indexed them with the dates of peasants' disputes, harvest fines, and small wars between brothers. The book grew heavy with ink. Record-keeping is a talisman for a conscience that does not know how to release. The town began to notice. They always notice, eventually. People who are called wander into alleys and remember things. They begin to nod at one another with a new, hard look, as if invisible ledgers had been posted above every hearth. There is a social ripple. Suspicion begets suspicion, and thieves know better than to strike a neighbor who might be carrying a naming. I could have kept my head down while the bell did its work. I could have stayed in the belfry and chalked the nights on a pillar. Instead, there came a night when the bell tolled and I recognized, in the thin key of the peal, a summons I could not ignore. It was for a man whose face I knew intimately because I had once believed myself his instrument. I had been younger then and fierce in ways that now taste like rust. We had been part of the same unit, and one night a command had been given that cannot be justified by any ledger of necessity. The man resisted or hesitated or perhaps simply misread the moment. Whatever the reason, his life slipped from the world with an abrupt, practical brutality that left no room for ceremony. It was framed as expedience. We called it a mercy. There are ceremonies in the language of convenience that make murder into maintenance. The lie eased the throat at the time. When the bell called him, he came crooked and weak, eyes along the rim clouded with the kind of shame that makes men feel they have no place in sunlight. I stood on the stair and watched his shadow stretch long and jagged across the stone like an accusation. It should have been simple. The bell rings, the called come, and the truth is laid bare. But truth is messy, it unspools in threads you did not anticipate. Once he was there, once we were face to face under the iron, he did not ask for my forgiveness. He asked, in a look that held every refusal I had given in my life, whether the bell would lift him free of what he had done or bury him along with it. In that look were all the small repudiations I had ever offered another man, the clipped remark, the withheld help, the glance away. In that moment the bell was less a judge than a mirror. I felt then the old argument between silence and proclamation flare into life inside me. If I pulled the rope, the bell would toll until dawn and call every guilty hand within earshot, a convocation of men bearing the same stain. If I held my hands from the rope, the bell might toll anyway. Sometimes it rings without being pulled. The bell moves as it wills. Sometimes it demands the hand of the keeper as a ritual, sometimes it calls on its own. The choice presented itself, not as a moral calculus, but as a question of consequence. Which sort of pain will we accept? Will we let the bell's sound shape the punishment, or will we let our small human choices do the work? I remember the texture of the rope under my fingers, rough, frayed in places, dyed by oil and wax and the sweat of 1,000 nervy pulls. I remember the way candlelight turned each strand into a memory of others who had pulled and who had not. I thought of the men who would come if I allowed the bell to ring, men I had seen at market and at funerals, men who had held a child too hard until something inside the child's head gave way, men who had bled another in silence while the world applauded them for survival. I thought of the town's judgment, which is a communal thing made of gossip and ledger and the sharp whiteness of teeth. I thought of the shape of consequences, how they arrive not as single blows but as a rain. The choice ought to have been immediate, a flick of fate. It was not. I weighed the idea of ringing as one weighs a blade in the palm, its balance, its edge, the sound it makes when it leaves its sheath. Pulling the bell was performing an act of exposure. It was to say to all who had ever closed a fist in anger or lifted a heel in contempt, "Come and bear witness." It would drag their private guilt into a public square and demand a response. Some would find redemption there, some would find reprisal. The bell does not settle these things, it only clears the field. I did what a man who has been living in the cold does. I thought of warmth. I thought of the human instinct to cluster, to name, to punish, to absolve all the rituals that make us feel less alone in our wrongdoings. I thought of silence too, and how it invites rot. Silence is an organism that feasts at night. Left unchecked, it grows and becomes a contagion. It rationalizes and builds altars to its rationales. I had spent years feeding silence with acts of omission. It had become a fat thing, heavy and slothful. There is something obscene about seeing a wrong baked into the bones of your life and choosing to tend it like a garden, because it will shelter you from the wind. Finally I pulled. I cannot say it was courage or cowardice. It was a mechanical decision. A hand moved, a rope slid through collused fingers, and for an instant the whole monastery vibrated like a throat clearing itself. The bell took my motion and answered, and the tone it produced was not mine to own. It rose through the stone and the air, silver and monstrous both, and the world seemed to tilt toward that sound as if the night itself were listening. What followed was not a cinematic unburdening. It was a convocation of slow, terrible returns. Figures who had been waiting in alleys crept closer, a woman with a face like a map of quarrels, her jaw set as if against the new knowledge. A boy whose hands were too young to hold the weight they carried, already stooped by its A man who had once been a magistrate, and who now walked with the uncertain gait of someone who knows his sentences have applied to himself. They gathered under the belfry and did not speak right away. Each had been called to, each bore some small, private dead thing between their ribs. They came not to be executed nor to be praised, but to be seen. I watched them as if I were studying the surface of a wound. Some wept aloud until the sound echoed like water in a cistern. Some held their jaws so tight the nails of their hands went white. The soldier who had been my companion put his palm to the bell as if to steady himself, and in that touch I saw the long ribbon of regret that had been his life wound taut. He did not blame me aloud. Blame is an expensive thing reserved for those with currency. Instead he folded inward, and for the first time I can recall, abjectly, humanly, seemed to ask for a mercy that would never come in any visible form. There are mercies that do not belong to men. At dawn the townspeople arrived, yawning and practical and ravenous for narrative. They brought with them the machinery of social accounting. I had thought that calling the guilty would mean a public confession and perhaps some kind of communal healing. I was foolish. Men prefer narratives with heroes and villains. They do not like ambiguity. The meeting under the belfry dissolved into accusations that had nothing to do with the bell and everything to do with old trades and lingering debts. The bell's call had given them an excuse to find new enemies, to index grievances they had been nursing like secrets. Some of the guilty were forgiven by a neighbor who wanted labor. Some were beaten by men who thought retribution should be theatrical, who wanted to stage a morality play with props. The bell had opened a window. Men dusted off old implements and decided who would pass through. The public need for story is voracious. It will eat nuance in the first sitting. I learned then that the bell does not save, it unseals, it unmasks. It hands the raw material of human failing to the very humans who are least disposed to administer mercy. We are a species that can name a sin and immediately look for purchase on it. Even so, in the collapse there were moments faint and stubborn where a man stood down from a prior posture and admitted the shape of his hand. Once, an old woman who had been called placed her palm under another's and tried to steady his trembling fingers. She did not demand a confession. She did not levy punishment. She offered steadiness. It was not a legal absolution. It was a small, human steadiness that is close to sacred in its narrowness. The consequences of that night followed me like a shadow that multiplies at sunset. I became known as the man who rang the bell that called the guilty. Some cursed me in market and at the well. Others brought me the kinds of food you bring to a penitent, crusts and warm porridge, as if basic sustenance could soothe your conscience. Priests muttered and tossed their eyes, laymen spat, and passed sentences over all. The townspeople had not expected to be witnesses to themselves. They preferred their sins tidy and their punishments theatrical. The bell had removed ease and substituted a rawer, more dangerous honesty. I write this as a witness and as a confessing agent with no hope of erasing the ledger I set in motion. The bell will toll again and others will come. The cycle continues because men prefer cycles to rupture, so a recurring bell is a habit more bearable than. I write with taped fingers and the steadiness of a man who has long practiced the economy of movement. The bell hangs where it has hung for centuries, a heavy iron throat fixed beneath the raftered black of the belfry, its rim nicked and pitted, its surface eaten into a map of old work and older stains. People think of bells as instruments of salving, of summoning the faithful, of measuring hours and absolving sins in the clear grammar of church time. This bell is none of those things. It speaks without hand, it tolls without wind, it calls. I am Brother Marek. I kept the rope for 22 years, and I tended the flame that burned in the chapel bellows. I was given the post because I was sturdy and because I did not speak much. I had the look of someone who can hold a secret and let it harden. I learned the rope by muscle and memory how I learned the bell by listening. The monastery is dead now to the living, but not to the tolling. Every midnight it rings, once for each person here who has killed another human being. You must understand the logic as if it were a kind of arithmetic, one bell for one taking of life. The sound is not musical. It is a mechanical accounting, a blunt ledger scraped in iron. It begins as a low, single breath that shudders through the rafters and through the bones of the building. It does not fade the way ordinary bells do-hit keeps a presence, a kind of pressure that sinks into the marrow. Those whom it names know it. They wake with it. They turn in their sleep as if pulled by a hidden tether. Sometimes they rise immediately, as if to answer. Sometimes they remain still, mouths open, as if the naming removes some future they had been bargaining for. Mostly, they walk toward the belfry. At first, I thought the bell was a trick of weather, of settling masonry. I told myself that the rotten roof shifted and that the rope, frayed and old, nudged the lip. But there are times when no rope moves, when the air is a river of absolute silence, and yet the bell speaks like a throat clearing a century of dust. It is not the bell that chooses, it is the bell that remembers. It remembers the touch that ended a life, the first panic, the way the hands changed from grasping to halting. Memory is how the bell chooses its victims. Guilt is the key. Guilt, the word tastes of iron and stale wine here. It is not a neat moral ledger. The bell does not read law, it reads the shape of causing. A man who defended his family from an armed intruder and struck a mortal blow will be called just as surely as a man who slit a throat in the dark for coin. The bell counts intent and consequence in a single voice. There is no absolution from it, only summons. I kept records at first out of the brittle curiosity of a watchman. I wrote names and dates on the back of a ledger stolen from the infirmary. I traced the pattern: a bell at midnight, someone gone the next dawn, a window shutter torn, a rope left coiled with salt on its fibers. The pattern hardened into method. When the bell called, the called man was either found gone or found near the bell, swing, fingers burned and raw, or, in the worst of nights, a hangman's slackness already in their limbs. There is a particular cadence to those nights. The corridors are colder than they ought to be. The candles tremble as if listening. The frogs and the owls stop to respect the thing. The first bell toll is a small grief that will not be named an iron sigh. It moves through the monastery like a footfall. It wakes the guilty, but it also wakes memory. Men remember with crystal clarity the last glance they gave to a dying face, the exact sound that had left another's mouth, the stupid words that came before the blow. It is not only a summons to answer in the world, it is a summons to be answered by the past you carry. I learned to stand in the shadow of the belfry and wait, because waiting here is a kind of study. The rope hangs like a spine of fray and salt. The wood beneath my palms sometimes vibrates with an aftersound. One night I found a smear of something dark on the bell rim, not fresh blood in the way a wound weeps, but a varnished stain, as if memory itself had left a smear. I could not wash it out. My hands trembled as if the mark communicated in a language my skin could not pass. Those who answer the bell do so in a variety of ways. Some come because they wish to be caught, to yield the secret and be relieved of the day-by-day arithmetic of it. A few of those are quiet when they climb the ladder and sit with the bell. They do not touch the rope. They seem to dream and to confess inside their own breaths. Others come with hands that tremble and go to the rope as if to claim recompense in motion. They want to pull and to be part of the action that once transformed them from bystander to killer. I have watched a man close his eyes, wrap his raw fingers around the strand, and heave until the tendon popped at his wrist. He did it because the motion seemed to reduce the enormity of his act to something physical and comprehensible. Not every ringing demands a death in the flesh. Sometimes the tolling takes what is left of a man in another way. I knew Brother Petter, who had smothered a child during a fevered fit of mercy because the child refused to stop seizing. The bell called him for 20 nights, and he came every night and sat beneath the iron like a man in appellate court. Gradually he became a thing of air. He stopped eating. His bones became quotation marks under his skin. The bell had taken from him not his breath at once, but his appetite for living. He left his bed one dawn in partial light, and was found beyond the western buttress with his hands empty. The bell's tolling had demanded a silence in life equal to the one he had given to the child. There is ritual here, though not of human design. The monastery's own liturgies, matins, vespers, the meaningless litany of dusting the altars become a background static over which the bell speaks. You come to recognize a sequencer. The bell calls the guilty wake and move. They either climb to the belfry or they sit and wait for the bell to fold them. Sometimes they go out into the yard and stand with their hands at their sides, as if to let the cold and the stone judge them. The bell does not judge for cruelty or motive, it orders restitution of a sort. It demands a reckoning. That reckoning is sometimes private and sometimes spectacular. I remember a man named Halleck who killed a rival in a tavern brawl. He had the look of someone who thought of himself as practical. He came to the belfry in the first stinging cold of autumn and climbed with a paper of thin excuses in his throat. He touched the bell rim and then, in a movement that will haunt me until my own end, he forced the rope until his knuckles split, and then kept pulling because he wanted to feel the pull of consequences. The bell swung and sang, and the rope caught his boots against the ladder. He hung there choking, not dead at once, but suspended between explanation and release. The bell tolled again for the man he had killed, but the bell tolled for Halleck as well once. A small accidental stutter that announced the double accounting the bell insists upon the act and the repercussion. I have tried, in the cold rationality that is left to me, to catalogue the edges where the bell's sense meets our human blindness. The bell's logic is narrow and inexorable. It names those who have taken. It has no mercy and no malice, it simply pronounces. The monastery, in return, has grown secretive and subtle. Men who once could look to the altar for solace will instead walk with small, furtive rituals. They keep talismans, they bathe hands in ash. They whisper prayers that sound like bargaining with a ledger. Nothing of that appeases the bell. It does not desire appeasement. Sometimes, at late hours, the bell rings for someone who is no longer alive among us. It tolls for ancestors and for men long gone until the sound is a catalogue of rot and regret. The living respond as if the past were a house they must still maintain. They clean the plates of those named. They set a stool near the hearth and leave a cup of stale wine. They become small caretakers of a penitent history. Once, after a night of merciless tolling, I walked the cloister and found dozens of cups lined along the window sills like a rusted parabola. In each was a tiny ring of residue. It looked as if the dead had been given a drink and then denied. There are nights when the bell calls for me. I will not be brave in print of the record should show the truth in the plainest way. I have killed. I have not always been the hermit the order imagined. There was a man who came to the monastery years ago and spoke of heresy and of a woman who had been burned in a smaller parish. He argued and I argued, and in the press of words I struck, and the man's breathing faltered and stopped. I have told myself reasons, self-defense, provocation, a suddenness that made my body move as if by accident. The bell does not care for reasons, it tolls. When it tolls for me, something in the air changes. I become methodical. I take the iron rosary I keep at my throat, and I hold it between my fingers until the beads are smooth. I count the knots in the rope where my thumb fits. I trace the thin scar along my left cheek, a souvenir of a time when violence carved me as well as I carved others. The bell compels a sequence of small penances. You stand, you prepare. You ask yourself whether to answer the bell by climbing and pulling or by staying and naming the thing in another way. The two choices are not equal. The bell prefers action because it is a thing moved by motion. There are those who think to bargain. They think that if they take the rope and toll a dozen times for those they claim to have saved, the bell will be appeased. It is a superstition as cruel as any. The bell does not accept substitution. It requires the one-to-one accounting of a life. You cannot weigh one soul against another and balance the scale. I watched a man try to ring for a soldier he had failed to save in a drunken raid. The bell swung and then recoiled as if in distaste and tolled for the soldier and for the man both. The building remembered and refused to be tricked. At times the bell's call invites violence in the living. Grief can be a crowded, violent thing. A sister whose brother was named by the bell once took a crowbar to the infirmary's locks, convinced that if he could destroy the ledger, he would be unmade. The monastery becomes a place where desperation seeks remedies in motion. Men have fought under the belfry for trivial slights that the bell's naming made epic. The bell catalyzes the small cruelties of men into ruinous momentum. In that sense, it is not only a bell here, it is a machine for making consequences. I keep writing because to put the pattern into language is to resist being taken by it. Language is scaffolding. I make lists that the bell cannot rearrange. I note times: the bell called at 1 minute past midnight, the bell called at 13 seconds after a bell struck hour. The bell called when the moon had gone and when it had been full. Patterns form and dissolve. There are times when the bell's counting is exact down to the breath, other times it is sloppy and human, as if even the iron occasionally miscounts. In the end, the question that the bell forces is not only whether you have killed, but what you will do when the instrument of accounting demands its own ritual from you. Will you climb and pull until your hands are raw, and then be taken by that very action? Will you stay and let the bell hollow you out from within? Will you flee into the winter and attempt to leave the monastery's jurisdiction? None of these are answers that lead to quiet. The bell does not stop for denial. I have seen men attempt to silence the bell by sawing at its supports. They cannot. The bell is older than their tools. I have known others to try to drown the sound in drums, and wild music noise only deforms the bell's voice into a smear of accusation. The only successful silence I have witnessed was a night when the bell did not ring, because there was no one here who had killed. That night the monastery was a place of broken sleep and fragile peace. The next night the bell found a man who had struck down a neighbor in an argument over corn, and resumed as if no hiatus had ever been considered. There is an epilogue to this ledger that sits unpleasant and unavoidable like a stone in the throat. The bell will continue after I am gone, because the world will continue to make and unmake itself with small cruelties and large ones. I have taken to writing the names of the called on pieces of wax and dropping them down the well. A superstitious act, yes, but also a way to hand the burden to the earth. The bell will have its accounting, and the earth will keep its small secret. If you come to the monastery, you will find a bell that rings with an implacable mechanical grief. You will find a rope eaten by salt and time. You will find a man who fingers a small iron bell at his throat, and who will confess without pleading. I tell you these things not because I beg for forgiveness, but because confession here is not hope, it is record. The bell will not be placated by my writing. It will not be comforted by ledger lines. It will do only what it has always done, call, retrieve, and make the world account. Listen, if you can, for a bell that rings in the dark, and know that it counts more than hours. It counts choices. It counts a single taking. If you hear it, do not imagine that you will be given an answer that is kind. The bell asks only that you answer, and in answering you may discover that the silence you once prized is worth less than the noise that demands truth. I have come to prefer the bell to silence, because at least the bell is honest. Silence simply buries the cost, and later generations will trip over the price we left behind. I will close this ledger now and place it in the chest, where I keep the keys. Perhaps someone will read it. Perhaps it will be found by my hand after I am taken by the sound I have helped to keep. If the bell calls for me tonight, I will climb as I have watched others climb, and I will do what the bell desires. If I do not answer, if I choose another end, let this page stand for me as the smallest of witnesses. I knew what the bell was, and I did not pretend it a friend. I will not pretend that the sound is solace. It is a summoner, and I am only a man who writes because writing is the last small hearth against forgetting. I began keeping a ledger the night I decided to write the bell's rules into ink, because memory alone would betray me. Stone remembers in a different way than men. Stone keeps an imprint, a bruise, a hollow that will not shift under wind or time. Men forget with a kindness that is a kind of rot. I wanted record. I wanted the ledger to be the friend that does not lie. The monastery had been empty longer than the sun would measure on that winter's courtyard. I had been alone years before loneliness learned its own voice. The bell tolled, and the toll was the kind of sound that peels memory skin by skin until the bone is shown. It calls not the living necessarily, but those who carry a weight that does not belong to their chest. It calls the guilty. That is how I place words to this guilty. The bell does not know nuance. It knows what tugs the threads of a soul so tightly that the thread pulls the bell itself. My hand trembled at first. There is a small, ridiculous ritual in beginning any ledger. The first line, the first seam cut into a blank page. I bought no new books. This was an old almanac, pages foxed and brittle, with a marginalia of a prior keeper, an enumeration of saints' days and rain counts. I wrote across the top of the first page the rules for the toll. It seemed necessary to name it like that, to anthropomorphize the bell into a creature that required governance. Habit, perhaps. Habit is a thin armor. It keeps the cold out for a time. There are rules, in fact, though the bell enforces more than I ever could. I write them down because the ledger demands sequence. The first is the simplest: the bell will toll of its own accord at midnight, or that hour you name by the moon in a sky of iron. It will call those whose hands have taken life, and whose hearts have not paid the price with silence. Silence is a kind of bargain, but the bell will not be satisfied with bargains where blood has been traded for convenience. I have seen it reach across years and pull men from quiet towns into rutted cloisters with nothing but a ringing in their bones. The second rule is the most terrible when the bell calls you. Proximity is not mercy. You may be half a country away and still find the toll braided into the clatter of your teeth. The bell has a map of old sins, and the map folds like skin. Once called, you will know. You will hear it under your sleeping breath, in the rust that gathers on spoons, and in the hollow of your skull. It will set a rhythm beneath your heartbeat until you stand or you do not. Men have told me, though there are few to tell now, that some run to the monastery as if its stones offer absolution. Others hide. Hiding only changes the exercise. The bell is patient and the monastery is not. I have inspected the bell myself. It hangs above a room that once knew prayer as a hunger. It is pitted and scarred, the lips smeared with something that looks like rust, and a darker residue that time cannot read. The rope that loops through its tongue is frayed, braided from the seasons of hands that have pulled it. When no living hand moves it, the bell still exerts a weight like gravity in the marrow of those it calls. The ledger will note the anatomy of the bell because records anchor the ephemeral. There is a third rule: the bell demands choice. It does not kill, it summons an answer. The summoned may climb the tower and pull the rope, and let their guilt be heard aloud in the only voice the monastery honors, or the summoned may refuse. Either path changes fate. Those who pull are changed by confession in a way that is not always merciful. There is a cost for being heard. The bell takes the confession, and confession is a transaction. In exchange for being rung, the confessor will keep something of themselves and lose something else. For some, ringing has been a penance that bleeds the mind later. For others, refusing to ring is a deeper rot. The bell will not be satisfied and will make the refusal a public thing by making the silence bloom into madness. I have watched both outcomes. I have watched a man with fingers like knotted roots climb the spiral and under the bell's watchful mouth, pull until his shoulders burned and his breath came like ragged prayer. The sound that came down to the cloister was not so much a bell as a long, torn throat. In the long afternoon that followed, that man walked with his head unmoored and his eyes full of a light that did not belong to him. He was quieter than before, but he retained a clarity that made sleep thin. Another refused. He sat in the kitchen, asleep facing the wall, his face folded into himself as though stitched there. He stopped answering the bell. The bell answered him by making his dreams into a weather he could not endure. He left the monastery in the morning and returned to a place that could not hold him. By the time winter ended, his wife had burned letters and raked embers of things that smelled like what he had been. There are more rules, because cruelty likes architecture. Rule 4: the bell chooses in a logic that is indifferent to guilt scale. A soldier who killed on a battlefield and a man who struck a lover once with a calloused palm may both be chosen. The bell counts intent and aftermath in ways I cannot translate into our law of words. It is an instrument of balance that does not pretend to be noble. It is precise. I have learned to listen for the edges of its choice, the way it raises a particular overtone that makes the hair at the back of my neck stand up. I write the tone-s description into the ledger. When the tone arrives, I lock my door. I take up the oil lamp, and I set the kettle to boil. We prepare at the monastery, though what we prepare for is never clear. Rule 5 is practical. Do not look at the bell at noon unless you mean to summon memory. The bell has a mirror quality. Facing it in daylight is to see reflection of your worst hours. Sunlight makes it merciless. Candlelight, in my experience, softens nothing but reveals certain colors otherwise hidden. It is under candlelight that the bell's scars look like scripture, and the bell's tongue looks like the last page of prayer. The ledger is also a catalogue of those who came and those who did not. I have a ledger page for each toll I have heard in the years since I took the rope. The entries are clinical at first dates, times, the weather outside, the wind in the spire, but they become less tidy as things accumulate. The hand grows ragged. The ink pools and runs like the bell's wake through the world. Some lines end with a marred blot I cannot read. Some end with a tiny sketch of a kneeling figure that emerged from my hand without my permission. There are names scratched sideways, crossed out, retraced. The ledger keeps the truth and the way my mind tries to hide it. There is one entry I return to more often than any other. It is not the worst of what the bell has summoned. It is mine, and there is a particular cruelty in that. I do not begin with where it happened, but with how it felt. The moment of the call is like a cold orb settling in the mouth. You will feel your teeth learn the shape of the sound before your lips do. The body knows what the bell wants before the mind lets in the possibility. The fight or flight is primitive and useless against an instrument that does not care for muscle. When I woke to the toll of that night, I dressed without thinking. Habit dictates monk's clothing like a second skin, and went to the tower with my oil lamp. The rope hung in its place, braided and patient, its fibers like the ridges of a palm. I stood under the bell and listened. The bell had chosen me. I do not write the act in detail because words make what has been done live again, and living is a thing I am trying not to feed. The ledger is oddly a parasite on itself. It eats memory and renders it into lines. Where the ledger fails me, the tower does not. The bell's mouth is a curve of iron. It looks like a mouth that has learned to wait. When I put my hand on the rope, my knuckles were thin and white, and I felt the smell of old rope and burnt wax. I pulled. The bell answered with the sound of a universe closing a door. Later, I thought the sound had calmed out something of me and left a tidy space where guilt might sit like a guest. Later, I discovered my hand would not stop trembling for months, and the ledger would be stained not from emotion, but from a secret small and private, a smear of rust I would not let air dissolve. The bell keeps no ledger for me, of course. It has no use for my method of keeping. It keeps an anatomy of those it chooses in the echo beneath the ribs. I write because I need to argue with myself was ringing less cruel than refusing. The ledger is a trial where I am both defendant and magistrate. Some nights I decide I did right. Some nights I decide I did not. The bell is indifferent to my verdicts. When people come to the cloister, they come with their own small deaths embroidered into breath. I have seen a woman arrive with mud on her skirts and a list of saints folded into her palm. She had killed with a look. She told no one, or rather the look had cost a life on a night she cannot speak about in daytime. The bell had called her, and she hugged the rope like an old friend. She rang until her voice in the sound was thin as thread. Afterward, she left as if something inside her had been guided into a coffin and nailed shut. That is the bargain again. You hand the bell the thing that chokes you, and it makes the choking audible and, sometimes, therefore, bearable. The bell's mercy is workman's in its economy. It does not absolve so much as shift the weight. I have also seen the bell take men in ways that were neither confession nor peace. Once a troop of deserters came, thinking to use the monastery as shelter and the bell as a tale to trade in taverns. The bell found a man among them whose guilt had been hid under jokes. At midnight it tollered. The man rose in the dark and did not climb. He sat instead on a bench and began to weep. They left, and later we found that he had hanged himself by a fragment of rope in the privy. The bell does not force hands, but it makes the scaffolding for certain ends if those ends are already waiting. Do not mistake the bell for morality. It is a catalyst. I have tried to trace its origin. Bells are human instruments. They are cast by men and named by men. There is a history in the lead, in the seam where two halves were joined. I lifted a shard once and found in the metal a thumbprint of ancient casting mishap, and, beneath it, engraving so worn I could not make the letters out. Perhaps the monastery spell is old enough to have learned new rules. Maybe it has been fed guilt for generations and grown ambitious. I leave this speculation in the ledger because speculation keeps me distant. Doubt is a hearth for the sane. There is a sound motif I note under every entry, a small, peripheral chiming that lives at the edge of the large toll. It is not audible to everyone. Some people have told me they do not hear it at all. I have the misfortune of hearing all of it. That peripheral ring is the bell's remark, its footnote. It is the small note that folds the confession into memory. When someone rings, you will hear it like a throat clearing at the end of a sentence. Tonight I write late, the lamp guttering like a small reluctant heart. Snow sits on the courtyard like a blanket that knows the shape of the stones and refuses to give it up. The bell has not tolled, and I keep expecting it. Expectation is a kind of hunger. It makes ordinary sounds monstrous. A mouse in the pantry becomes a footstep, a branch against glass becomes a hand on a grave. I have trained myself to read these adjustments. It is a skill. It is also a slow decline. There is a final rule I keep folded in the ledger close to my chest. The bell will not call you for sins you regret openly. It seeks secret weight. Repentance that is practiced in daylight, that is paraded with charcoal letters, is not its quarry. It chooses the small private cruelties, the cuts you hide beneath shirts, and the oaths you break in solitude. If you have already disclosed your crime to the air and to men and have atoned publicly, the bell will glance and move on. It wants what you think you can smother. That is what makes it terrible. It does not judge by harm, but by secrecy, and secrecy is a cruel metric. I will write another entry tomorrow. I will add a column for the sky, for the moon's face when the tolls come, and a small tally of how remorse changes people in the months after they answer. I will keep making the ledger thicker, because if ink is weight, then the ledger will grow heavy enough to anchor me. If I am dragged away someday into silence, let this book remain like a fossil. Let it be proof that I saw the bell and named what it does. For those who read this ledger in future and expect a manual for survival, know this: there is no manual. There is only listening, a patience like a wound, and the nauseous arithmetic of choice. If the bell calls you, you will have to decide. I have nothing but the ledger and its cold laws. I can offer no absolution. I can only tell you what I have seen, that the toll is a question posed in iron, and the answer changes you. Whether that change is mercy or malediction depends on the margins of your life and the way the bell writes you down. If I am to close this page, I will do so with a confession that is not wholly mine. The bell is not only a judge. Sometimes it is a bringing forth. Sometimes it unravels someone who would have kept his sin like a sleeping dog and forces him to look. In the dim aftermath, some return with a face scrubbed raw by tears and regret, and some leave cleaner and quieter because the bell made the stain visible and therefore manageable. That knowledge does not comfort me. Instead, it complicates the ledger. Complication is another word for being alive. So I will set this book aside for the night and tend the lamp until it is an ember. Outside, the world breathes in the blue cold. If the bell tolls, it will write a new line on the next page and teach me another law. If it does not, the silence will teach the same. Either way, the monastery will be, as it always has been, a place where sound and stone conspire to keep secrets honest. This is the 7th chapter of my ledger. I bind it with the ink of memory and the hard truth that the bell rings not to punish in simple terms, but to make a private thing public. Those drawn to the sound find their choice is always between more and less suffering. There is no clean absolution. Centuries may pass and the bell will continue its business, indifferent to our names. I write this because the ledger helps me sleep a little better. The bell does not care if I do. I write with hands that remember the rope, as if it were a living thing. The fibers dig into the skin of my palms when I close them, an imprint that will not wash away beneath soap and prayer. The monastery has been a map of absence since the last brother left his cell and never returned. Wind through broken tracery keeps the hours, and pigeons make nests in places where men once knelt. But there is a clock here that is not stone or cog, a voice made of bronze and rust that summons like a conscience made audible. The bell tolls at midnight with no hand to pull it, and no wind to move the rope. It rings for one kind of listener, only those who have taken a life. I have kept the bell longer than any other thing in this place. I am not proud of that. I am tired in a way that goes below tiredness, something that settles into cartilage and bone and becomes memory. Even now, when I pass the stairwell where I once carved our names in the ash, my fingers go to the iron rosary at my throat. The little bell tied there answers nothing. It is a comfort fashioned to a useless endra, a sound so small it might be a lie. The ledger my hand keeps is the only honest thing I own. It is a book bound in rough leather, its archival pages mottled with wax, soot, and the occasional smear that will not be described by polite words. I feed it entries the way others feed pigeons stale crumbs. Each entry is a Talia night, a name, a thing that the bell wanted me to see. I do not write to purge. Writing here is an incision that leaves an H, an exactitude that cuts away nonsense. The ledger exists because the bell does not forgive forgetting. There were nights when the toll felt like a question asked softly across the sockets of my eyes. Who are you? Who did you make silent? A ring, a hollowness, and the sound wound through the rafters and into memory. Memory is treacherous and theatrical. It arranges evidence as if for a play and dresses itself in motives it cannot prove. But sound has a blunt honesty. When the bell calls, the body answers before the mind does, with the same animal recognition that will fetch you from sleep at the scent of smoke. The bell is old. It bears the pockmarks of many hands and the faint inscription that once promised grace. The face of the bell is smeared in dark stains that are not simply old iron. I have suspected explanations: rust mixing with soil, tar used in ancient sealing, some trick of light in the tower. I have compared them and catalogued them and, in quieter moments, smelled the odor that clings to the skin, metallic and sweet, and my stomach has turned in a way that prayer does not soothe. People will offer saints an alibis for the things they cannot face. The bell tells no stories, it rings for the guilty and only for them. When I first heard it, I was younger and less broken. I woke to a sound that vibrated through the stones as if the monastery itself had been a throat. I climbed the stairs in slippers with holes in the toes and found the rope still, the clapper still, the baying was absent of mechanical cause. There was only the echo, and later the revelation: footprints in the dust leading to a cell where a brother had once lain. He had wanted to leave. He had not the means. He had made a choice that night that the bell did not allow. I write this not to excuse him. I write it because the ledger will not lie down and keep secrets. The bell does not draw all who live here. It draws those who have closed a life. There is no mercy in the manner of its summoning. If you have taken a life by accident, by mercy, by malice, the bell will sound you out the same. I have seen men who killed in war, in mercy, in mistake, cross themselves and step onto the stone threshold as if into flame. They go hollow after the toll. Some of them return to their cells and do not speak of what they saw. Others do not return at all. The choices they make under the bell's urgency are acts of both theatre and truth. They clarify what the dark does not admit, that some doors open only from one side. I have been asked, and I suppose I ask myself in nights when the ledger stares back, whether the bell punishes or reveals. The difference is the thinnest of threads. Punishment implies intention, her revelation implies accident. The bell simply rings. It makes a demand without a face. The men who come answer with ritual, confession, or flight. The ledger is not interested in ceremony. It wants to be accurate. When the bell called a man who had killed in anger, the ledger shook with the man's handwriting, small and afraid. When it called one who had killed to save a child, the hand was steadier and the ink more deliberate. The bell is not sensible to motive. It is indifferent to context. It is only a tribunal of vibration. I have guided more than one man to the tower. Some came with a limp or a tremor, as if guilt had already arranged their bodies into frailty. Others came with a defiance that peeled from their faces like old skin. One kept his hands in his sleeves and stared at the rope in a way that suggested he planned to climb the tower himself. He did not. Another, a man who had been a soldier and had killed in a way the soldier would have called duty, climbed to the gallery and pushed his face to the parapet, as if searching for the horizon where his sin might dissolve. The bell called them simply. The choices they were offered were always the same: to answer the sound by confession, by renunciation, by violent ends, or by swinging the rope yourself. I have seen each of these answers exercised with a sanctimony that made the stone feel thin. There is a part of me that catalogues technique, how a hand shakes when a man knows the rope must be touched, how a mouth presses into a line and never opens, how eyes, which are theaters for memory, either dry into masks or flood and make a stain. I map these things because mapping is what I can do when the world becomes too ridiculous for prayer. The ledger has grooves in its margins where my thumb drags. My habit has patches in exactly the places described in the record of my life: elbow, knee, collar. I mention these details for a practical reason. If anyone reads this ledger and mistakes the shape of me, I would like them to know that the keeper of the bell keeps an unromantic account of his knavery. At times I have considered silence. The easiest thing would be to stop writing, to close the ledger and hide the pages beneath loose stones. The bell would still toll, and people would die or save themselves or walk out into the night and vanish. Perhaps the bell prefers oblivion and works harder to prevent it. The ledger exists, in part, to attract attention like a wound attracts flies. I do not want to hide. I want to record the truth in a place where other truths are buried under pious words and honorary plates. The monastery's history is salted with saints whose biographies gleam. My ledger is salted with stains that do not glow. There are rules, tacit and brutal, that the bell enforces without mercy. First, go to the bell naked excuses. The rope tolerates no hedging. Second, do not attempt to bribe the sound. I have seen offerings placed on the bell's rim: coins, dried flowers, a scrap of lace, as if the bell had a stomach. It took nothing, and the offerings blackened like the rest. Third, if you are called, do not make bargains with the night. The bell is not a negotiator. Those who try end up in leakager confessions that skip to the edges and never tell what the bell wanted. The ledger keeps full confessions, partial ones, and the kerfuffle of memory that passes for explanation. It is an archive of human avoidance. The bell's summons does not operate alone. Sound is a net, and with the bell run other noises that press into the mind, a drip in the cellar that matches the beat of a heart, a feathered wind that pinches memory into focus, a scraping that could be an animal, or the long fingernail of guilt running along the walls. I have learned to listen to the chorus around the bell. When the bell rings and the drip begins to imitate speech, a man will sometimes mistake the rhythm for absolution. He thinks the world is confessing with him. It is not. It is remaking him as an instrument of memory. I keep a ledger not only of names but of methods. Some men come and lay hands upon the rope, and the rope becomes an extension of their intent. Some shake it once, half-hearted, and the bell answers by letting loose a sound that is like an accusation. Others grasp and pull and bring themselves to a kind of mechanical penance. You can tell much about a man by the way he touches the rope. The rope remembers, too. The hemp is scarred by the grip of fingers that pressed too hard, and by those that could not bear to let go. When a man kills by design, when he bends an instrument into reason and aims it, there is a meditation in his hand that the rope drinks. The ledger notes these things. There is an episode recorded here that I will not cleanse of its cruelty by softening its edges. A man once returned after killing his brother with a knife meant for butchery. He had thought it a small, private act, a quarrel, a slip of temper. The bell called him for the life he had taken, and he came to the tower in a state of polite bewilderment. He denied the gravity of his deed with the same blandness one uses to deny hunger. I walked with him up the stairs. At the lip of the bell chamber he stopped and said nothing. The room was full of the sound of the building settling. He wrapped his hands around the rope and did not so much pull as submit to it. The bell swung like a pendulum, and the sound cleaved the cellars and the courtyard. When it finally stilled, he looked at me as if this were a theatrical end. He left the tower and walked down into the cold and did not come back. The ledger records his leaving. Months later, a hanged man was found on the outer wall, a body unknown to the records who might have been him or might have been someone else. The bell's logic and the world's logic are not coterminous. There are patterns to the ledger's cruelty. The bell tends to call those who intend concealment more often, as if secrecy is a seasoning that the bell finds delicious. It calls the men who commit violence in the half, light of fact and myth, those who convince themselves that their reasons are enough. It calls women and children, too, though rarely, and the ledger's entries on those nights are the least legible, because grief has a way of wrecking a hand. I once found a page where the ink had been smeared into a map of tears. I left that page unturned for a long time, because it felt indecent to look at someone else's sorrow as if it were a specimen. Sometimes the bell's call is a mercy. There are those who killed for causes that would be called righteous, and found that the bell made them small and unmanageable. The sound turns the great narratives of men into ragged things. A magistrate who had signed a sentence that killed dozens came to the tower, and under the bell's incantation, admitted misgivings that could not alter the dead, but could make the living shiver with recognition. In that way the bell divorces sin from righteousness. It does not ask whether a killing was necessary or not. It only refuses to be fooled. In the ledger there is a fold of pages dedicated to the nights when the bell did not ring. They are the oddest to me, because absence sometimes shouts louder than sound. On nights when the bell ought to have called when someone had killed and the scent of blood was sharp in the yard, the silence sat like a verdict. Those nights taught me that the bell's logic is not ours. It is not linear. It is a pattern you see only when you let yourself stop being credible. The ledger keeps these exceptions because I am a man who prefers not to be lied to by the world. There is an end to every story here, because our bodies insist upon ends. I have done my work with a steady hand, and I have known the sting of failure. The ledger has failed to save men from themselves more times than it has not. I might say, in the austere style of confession, that I am a servant to a mechanism I do not understand. I might say that I am cold and detached, and it would be true. I might say that sometimes, after a night of ringing, I go down to the courtyard and press my face to the stone until the texture prints itself on my skin. That is also true. I am not heroic. I am a witness. This chapter of my ledger ends in an act of choosing. The bell will call me as it calls all who have blood on their hands. I am not young. I am not red of heart. I have killed not by stroke of ceremonial malice, but by the small and accumulating acts that make a peerless silence. I chose silence over intervention once, and that moment has followed me like a shadow. The bell asks me, without rhetoric, whether I will answer. There is a rope in the tower. There is also the ledger, and in its pages I imagine a man who is not me, who might be me, who makes the only differently cruel decision to tend the bell until his fingers rot, and to close the book without telling the truth. I write this so that, should the bell call you, you will understand at least one thing: sound is a tribunal. It does not always reward repentance, but it makes it inevitable. The choice the bell demands is not between guilt and innocence. It is between recognition and a lifetime of pretending. Some men will treat the bell as a punishment. Some will treat it as an instrument of atonement. I keep the ledger to force the world to reckon, if only for a page, with the fact that the sound that calls us is made of bronze and old dust, and the weight of our own designs. If you ever hear a bell in the middle of the night that has no hand and no wind, do not be quick with pious words. The sound has a purpose. Listen. Remember the shape of your own hands when they meet the rope.